Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese economy, and the third plenum committee meeting, central committee meeting just happened, and the focus is on the economy. So, and then I just have been to China, so I guess I can share a little bit my own observation. Now, when I was in China, I have to say, wherever I go with my friend, with my parents, when we go out to eat and or doing whatever, there's just always plenty of people. They're always packed. So from that perspective, I don't feel the economy is bad per se. And of course, there's plenty of cars on the road. It's always jammed, etc. So at least I think people are spending money. I do think they are. Now, my background is Huanglong, Yellow Dragon. It's a beautiful area together with another part not far from this park is called Jiuzhaigou in Sichuan province. It's just a beautiful area, huge area. And Scott and I, my husband, so we went there just for our own little bit getaway. We spent like 3 days or 4 days there. It's also packed with people. And remember, this is regarded in that park is regarded as a low season, as like a slow time, because the high season is the fall when all the beautiful, trees and leaves and stuff. But even the low season, there's still a lot of people. So wherever we go, it seems like on the surface, at least, I think people are spending money. So that's my first observation. Now, there is a real estate bubble. I do think there is one, but it's mainly focused in the big cities. I think in the third tier, fourth tier, smaller cities, I think their houses are still reasonable. It is big cities that the price has gone out of control. And I feel like Xi Jinping himself actually want to see some kind of price reduction. He actually want people to be able to afford housing. He said that. He said houses should be for living and not speculating. He actually said that. So I feel like for some people who really can't afford a house to this point, see some price dropping is not a bad thing. Just my personal feeling. So. And then the latest number in Beijing, at least I saw there is an increase, a pretty big increase on the volume in terms of the turnover. So it seems like the price have dropped to come to a point where people started to buy again. Seems like that's the real estate bubble. But then there are some other problems. Of course, one of my friend who's working in a bank, she did got a pay cut. So there are some problems, and she's saying that it's the economy is slowing down, and some people are struggling, etc. So there's a real issue with the Chinese economy. Now, I want to ask you the reason, because if you look at the analyst in the West will say, oh, that's because the Xi Jinping is a heavy hand, and it causes the people are afraid to invest, and all those sort of things. But I don't think that's the reason. The third plenum committee meeting, their analysis is there is a worldwide slowdown, uncertainty, etc., etc. So what do you think?
Right. Well, I think a number of things to say here. First of all, and it's essential to understand this, economy that has grown as fast as China must mathematically at some point start to slow down. I mean, if you have an economy that's worth $100 billion and it's achieving 10% growth, that is entirely, you can understand that. But if you have an economy that is now, as China's economy is, an economy of $35 trillion, then you're not getting 10% growth for an economy that size, which has been growing as rapidly as China's economy has done for 30 plus years, is not realistic. It is not possible, and it would be extremely dangerous to try to maintain that kind of level of growth. So the fall in the growth rate is an organic development. It is a necessary adjustment to the fact that the economy has developed now to a very, very high level and has begun to mature. Now, when that happens in an economy, there is usually a period of adjustment when you go down from, say, 10% growth, which China had, to roughly 4 to 5% growth, which is what China probably is going to start to see. There's going to be an adjustment because people who have become accustomed to growth rising at 10% a year, suddenly for them, a growth rate of 4 to 5% might look like slow growth, even though for everyone else in the world, it would look like very, very fast growth indeed. The other thing is that in a period of very, very fast growth, imbalances in the economy start to appear, and savings start to rise very fast. Spending starts to rise very fast. Lending can often become very slack. A lot of that lending goes into fixed assets like real estate. And that's one of the reasons why there's been a bubble. And then deflating that bubble in itself causes a slowdown. And that can affect also people's perceptions that the wider economy is indeed slowing down. Now, Xi Jinping, who I think has a very, if I can say, classical approach to economics. If you follow the American economist Michael Hudson, you will understand what I mean. Michael Hudson has often spoken about the importance of an economy functioning to benefit producers and creators as opposed to rentiers. And he makes the entirely correct point, by the way, that classical economic theory of the 19th century also sought to achieve the same thing. They were very distrustful of what they saw as unearned income. They wanted income to be earned through the production side of the economy. And I think Xi Jinping is very much instinctively of that view. And I don't think he's just alone in this. I think this is a widespread view within the Chinese economic leadership. Bear in mind that they all trained in economics, Marxist economics, as Michael Hudson correctly points out, are based on classical 19th century economic theory. So what I think they want to do is they want to reduce rent seeking within the economy and refocus the economy back towards production, investment in production, wealth creation, that kind of thing. Now, if you look at the decisions that came out of the third plenum, it seems to me that is completely consistent with this. They want to deflate the bubble, the real estate bubble. They're very nervous. They're concerned about the real estate bubble. They sense that in some places it has got out of control, that it's been encouraged by some regional governments as well, because that has helped their tax incomes and things of that kind. But what they want is a China that invests its savings in the productive side of the economy, particularly in the high technology side of the economy and in infrastructure and in such things. And that is what the third plenum, it seemed to me, was trying to do. It is directing China more back towards that kind of approach to the economy. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with a heavy hand of Xi Jinping, or him acting as a dictator, or wanting to impose Stalinist controls on everything and taking China back to the philosophies of the 1960s and the Gang of Four and any of that kind of nonsense that we're reading about in the West. I mean, this is absolute nonsense. I mean, it bears no resemblance to what the third plenum, and this is more than just Xi Jinping, are talking about. On the contrary, if you again also look at the communique that came out of the third plenum and the various other documents and commentaries that have appeared, they in fact want to, from what I could see, they actually want to increase competitiveness within the economy. They want, in fact, as they would put it, a further opening up. They do not want an economy that is, centralized and controlled and monopolistic and all that kind of thing, because again, they see that as also creating a whole further set of imbalances in the economy. What they want, essentially, is a dynamic industrial, manufacturing, high-tech economy um, spurred by extensive internal competition within a functioning and well-structured market inside China. And I think that is their conception for the future. And as to the decline in growth rates around the world, that is absolutely correct. Since 2008, growth has declined right across the world. And of course, in the West, it's declined markedly so. Following the pandemic, growth rates have declined even further in the West as well. And that has also been a limit on growth because, of course, given that today China is the world's biggest manufacturer and the biggest exporter, and is a country that runs a trade surplus of in excess of $800 billion a year, which is astonishing. The question then becomes who is going to buy all this vast output that China is producing? And that inevitably, if the global economy is slowing, that affects on the ability of China to sell its goods, and that inevitably translates back into the economy itself and causes it to slow. But I think, as I said, there's lots of things going on in this picture. It's not just the slowdown in the global economy. It is the maturing of the Chinese economy. It's the working out of the imbalances that developed during the period of very fast growth. It's also working through some of the imbalances that arose as a result of the very intense liquidity that the Chinese government inserted into the economy after the 2008 crisis. When there was the 2008 crisis, it looked like there would be a universal collapse in demand. So the Chinese government decided that an economic stimulus in China was needed, and it worked. It meant that the economy continued to grow, but it also meant that there was a lot of excess money, moving around inside the economy. And that partly was what helped to create the real estate bubble. So they have to drain that out, and they want to get back into an economy which is, as I said, focused on production, on manufacturing, on high technology, lots of emphasis on high technology and on infrastructure.
Yeah, they use the word high quality development, right? So
Exactly.
it's AIs, chips, and EVs, those areas that I think they will mention that. And one thing I do agree that I think in general the Chinese government like to encourage competition, both in the business world, but also I think they like to see competition amongst different cities. So like different regions and provinces, they actually like to see the competitions because that's how you encourage, right? You motivate the leaders in the different levels to do better, right? So I do think they I mean you can tell that when they reporting on things, Beijing and Shanghai, they kind of like a Hong Kong, they do tend to, I mean, they even rank like a GDPs at different provinces, etc. So there is that mentality that I think it helps to stimulate the development in that sense. Now, go ahead.
Oh, absolutely, I completely agree. And in fact, even I, from Britain, can see that. There's a friend of mine who is something of person takes a big interest in China, a British scholar called Kerry Brown, former diplomat, and he's actually written a book about Chinese cities. And he says he discusses precisely this way in which the cities compete with each other, and that there is enormous dynamism, that the way that creates a kind of dynamism also within the overall economy.
And when they say heavy hand, what I can see, and I think that's probably more or less the consensus in the Chinese media and the Chinese people, is that Xi Jinping has been heavy hand in terms of cracking down on corruptions and tax evasions and those sort of things. But in the West, they somehow think that's they see that as heavy hand. I think they just don't like to see China. Even now, they still don't like to see China to focusing on high-end, high-tech development. In their view, they still want China to just do the low-end manufacturing, like a t-shirt and hats and those sort of thing. When you go to the higher up, I just think that in general the West just don't like that. They feel like those are their areas. In particular, the U.S. they feel like they should be the one who has the high margin areas. Just to give you an example, I think in China there's people talk a lot about this. It used to now the T-shirt, there's a shirt that people manufacture. It takes about 700 or 800 million shirt for one Boeing 747 or something like that. Just to give you an idea, right? Of course, for the U.S., they want to keep Boeing that part of a business for themselves, and China should continue to manufacture millions of shirts, shoes, that kind of business. I think there's still that hoping and thinking that's where China should be, and not going to the high end part of the business.
You are you are absolutely completely right. I mean, what the Chinese are doing and daring to do is that they're trampling on what the West, and in particular, as you correctly said, the United States, but all of the Western countries think is absolutely their, preserve. I mean, it's fine. We produce all the high-tech goods. We do all the high-tech jobs. We have all the science. We have all the, all the really good industry. We're the leaders. It's fine. You can make us our shoes and our hats and our, toy, all those little things. But, under no circumstances must you ever dare to think that you can compete with us at the very high end of technology. Maybe you can do up to a certain point what Taiwan did, with chips, and South Korea to some extent has done with chips, but you do that in order to service us. And of course, you do that within the framework that we set for you. An independent Asian country moving forward and not just, competing with the West at the very highest end of technology and industry, but actually surpassing it. That is absolutely horrifying for them. I mean, that goes completely contrary to the entire conception that the West has about itself, which is that it imagines itself to be the vanguard of human civilization, and everybody else is following behind. I mean, this is, and by the way, this, I think we have to face this fact. This is a feeling that isn't just confined to leaderships, or it is widely held amongst the intellectual classes right across the West, and also amongst an awful lot of ordinary people. I mean, they instinctively believe that it is they who ultimately represent, the top end of humanity. It will be a massive psychological shift for them too, a very unwelcome one, if they suddenly discover that the Chinese are more advanced than people in the West are, and horror of horrors, have higher living standards one day than they do. So this isn't something to be underestimated. And we now come to, of course, another factor which China has to contend with, which is the hostility of the West. And this is where the whole Xi Jinping heavy hand and all of this comes from, because as China develops in this kind of way, the West is threatened by it in its psychological self-conception of itself. So, of course, it has to find some way to justify the steps that it's going to start taking to reverse that. So they start talking about, China, the dictatorship, the autocracy. And of course, that means going after the leader of China, who has to be the dictator, the oppressor, the person with the heavy hand, and all of those things. this is a narrative that has been constructed around Xi Jinping. It bears no connection to reality at all. Just like the whole, wolf warrior story has no connection to reality at all. Even intelligent people that I know talk about China becoming more assertive. Where? How? In what way? What has changed? Nothing has changed, except that China is rising and the West doesn't like it.
About Boeing, I mean, the problem is Boeing is destroying itself, right? It's not like China is coming in now. Of course, China is manufacture big airplanes and in the process of doing that. But Boeing, look at all the latest scandals. They just they don't produce good products themselves, right? They can only blame themselves. They cannot blame China or anyone for that matter, right?
Well, absolutely, that's absolutely correct. I mean, it is one of the examples of the great decline that has taken place in the United States. That what used to be this A1 company that produced all these extraordinary products, starting with the bombers of the Second World War, which were the linchpin of it, but then going on and producing, the Boeing 707. Then the 747 and 737 and all of those, which revolutionized air transport around the world and did this on a massive industrial scale. Anyway, the fact that they aren't able to do this anymore because of the extreme financialization of the US economy, which has now impacted on the way Boeing itself is run. Well, absolutely. That is exactly right. You're talking about a company that is no longer geared towards high quality production. It is a company that is geared towards stock market valuations, profits, those kind of things, and it shows. But beyond that, I mean, there is again a very strange attitude that because the Americans have an aerospace industry, that means that China mustn't have one. I mean, that's what it amounts to. I mean, if the Chinese are going to produce good civil airliners, which they are, by the way. I mean, they're going to. This is an absolute certainty. So are the Russians, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, the Russians are also heavily investing in their civil aerospace industry, and they will also be producing airliners as well. If they're going to do that, then that's their business. If Boeing was a well-run company, it would be able to handle the competition. It's because it is not a well-run company that it cannot. And trying to support a badly run company is going to hurt American consumers and Western consumers if they are denied access to the superior products of the Chinese and who knows, even the Russians one day. So, I mean, everybody's getting this the completely wrong way round. But as I said, the subtext, again, of a lot of this discussion is that how dare the Chinese start building their own jetliners? That's not what they should be doing. They should confine themselves to making T-shirts. That's all they're good for. And of course, it doesn't work like that today. It's, by the way, profoundly anti-historical. My wife was a graduate of Cambridge University, and her college is Gonville and Caius College. And one of the major academics at Gonville and Caius College was a man called Joseph Needham. And he wrote a wonderful book. It's in fact not a book, it's a huge encyclopedia about the Chinese science and of the great innovations of Chinese science. It's huge. And what you realize very, very quickly is that for the greater part of its history, China was actually the most technologically advanced region in the world. If you look at, Chinese bronze casting, even at the time of the Shang Dynasty, it was more advanced than what was happening in Europe. So China becoming again a technological leader is simply China returning to its historic place. It is not China usurping a position that it doesn't deserve, which is a ridiculous idea anyway.
Yeah. And also for just the past few days, there are a couple of things happened. So Kuluba's visit,
Mm.
um, which I got a very mixed information, exactly what he's doing. But one thing for sure is that I think Zelensky's government is in a pretty difficult position right now. The war is not going well. We all can see that. And the Trump is coming, and it's not clear exactly how Trump had in mind how he wants to end the war. But one thing is that he's not going to be so-called supportive as Biden has been. But to be honest, even let's say Kamala Harris got into the office, I'm not sure she can continue to, because the last time that Biden was asking the 60 billion, it was pretty tough for him. He got
Mm.
it, but it was already lots of resistance. So even Kamala Harris, I don't know whether how much she can help. I mean, the war seems to me like it has to end at some point. The only question is at what term, on what term. And that seems Zelensky realized that, right? So seems to me that's what Kuleba is trying to do to figure out what China can help them to do something, mediation or something. Is that your impression? What
You
is the
are ab-
purpose?
you are absolutely completely correct. In fact, I've done a program on my channel in which I've discussed a lot of this. What has basically happened is that over the last few weeks, the government in Kiev has finally realized that he's going to lose the war. They've been deluding themselves with all sorts of fantastic ideas that somehow things were going to be turned around, that the F-16s would come in and were going to make a huge difference, that Russia's economy was going to collapse, that the Americans would come up with some great solution, that the missiles would that the Americans had given them would have some kind of dramatic effect. And they've now come to understand that none of that is going to happen. And they are looking at an absolutely catastrophic situation on their battlefronts. And I've just come from making my own program today, and I did a summary of the military situation. And we are getting into a situation where the Russians are capturing fortified positions after fortified positions, advancing tens of kilometers. Ukrainian troops in one place over the last 24 hours fled en masse rather than fight the Russians. The whole situation on the front lines is collapsing. And to the extent that the Americans were offering support, it's now becoming increasingly clear, firstly, that they can't, that they've run out of what they can do to support Ukraine. By the way, this is the single biggest and most important fact about the Ukraine war, that it has exposed the limits of American military and industrial power, that the Russians can produce far more shells than the Americans can, that the Russians can produce far more tanks than the Americans can, that they can do all of these things, that America's industrial strength has withered to the point that it is no longer able to do this any longer. And the Americans are telling the Ukrainians, are starting to tell the Ukrainians, look, even if we wanted to help you, we've now reached that point where we simply can't. And I think what also happened was that Zelensky had this telephone call with Trump. Apparently, Trump told him, you cannot win. You're up against the Russians. The Russians defeated Napoleon and Hitler, and they're absolutely going to defeat you. Apparently, the Trump himself has told us that he told Zelensky this. And so I think the penny has dropped. I think the Ukrainians understand that they're going to lose the war and they're going to lose it badly. So they're now desperately looking for people who can help them to get out of it. They know that the Europeans can't, because the Europeans have antagonized the Russians completely. They know that the Americans are all over the place because their political system is in chaos. And so they're searching for others. So they asked the Vatican, the Pope of all people, to send an emissary to Kiev who told them, look, you've got to start negotiating. But of course, the Vatican is hardly in a position to conduct negotiations with Russia or to broker talks with the Russians. And the Russians probably wouldn't accept the Vatican as a mediator. And so who else to go to? Well, there's only one country, and that is China. Now, just a few weeks ago, you remember when Li Hui was in Kiev, the Ukrainians were unspeakably rude to him. Now they've had to rush off Kuleba to Beijing, and Kuleba is telling the Chinese, look, we do want to talk, we want to negotiate, help us find some means to negotiate. And of course, the subtext is we know now that we're going to lose, but the Ukrainians, even though they know they're going to lose, I get the sense that they're still not ready for serious talks which will involve the kind of concessions that the Russians are bound now to insist on. So they've reached that level of understanding that negotiations are inevitable and that if they don't negotiate, they're going to lose the war. But they've not reached that point where they understand the nature of the concessions that they're going to have to make.
So intellectually, they know they are not going to win. This is the direction. They know where it's going to end. But emotionally, they just cannot accept the concession that is required. Yeah.
Correct. And they're asking the Chinese to square the circle for them. So they're sending Kuleba to Kiev, to Beijing, and they're asking Kuleba to telling Kuleba to tell Wang Yi, please arrange negotiations and get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire. Because that's what Ukraine most wants now. They don't want to make any concessions. They want the Russians to agree a ceasefire. And the Russians, who've been caught this way out before, are not going to agree a ceasefire. They say, we're prepared to sit down and we're prepared to negotiate, but we are not interested in a ceasefire at this time. And I think China is going to tell the Ukrainians, look, it is not our business to square the circle for you. The right thing for you to do is to sit down and talk with the Russians. Out of those negotiations and those discussions, hopefully a ceasefire will come. But it's not our business to throw our weight around on your behalf and to twist the Russians' arms and to get the Russians to do something that the Russians don't want. In fact, the Russians might very well resist it. And anyway, it's not in our interest and it's not our nature to do something like that. You've got to accept that the Russians have their own views about how this war ends. You've got to negotiate with them in good faith. If you sit down and start to do that, something might happen and negotiations can begin in earnest and we will get to a ceasefire eventually, but not in the way that you want.
Which means, I guess, out of this visit, there still won't be a real ending of the war. Not real soon. Is that what you're saying?
Not immediately.
Okay.
But where, and I've been in these kind of situations many times. This is, my legal work. When I was often a mediator, by the way, what you often find is that people are exactly the sort of situation that you described the Ukrainians in. Intellectually, they know they're going to lose. Emotionally, they're not prepared to make the necessary concessions. And they resist. Weeks pass, months pass. Their situation continues to go from bad to worse. But eventually, left with no alternative, they have to listen to the advice and they finally sit down and talk. And then they realize finally that what they want, which is the ceasefire first and the negotiations after, isn't going to happen. It will have to be the other way around. First the negotiations and then the ceasefire, and the ceasefire coming out of the negotiations.
In the meantime, they continue to lose, people and possibly lose more territory, right?
Yeah.
That is so incredibly unfortunate, I find, for Ukrainians, right? That if you're going to lose, you're going to lose. Why don't you just, stop the bleeding now, right? That get whatever out of it, but they have to drag it on and on until they absolutely have nowhere to go, right? They have to.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Putin has already told them what they can do. If they want to stop the fighting tomorrow, they announced that they're going to withdraw completely from the 4 oblasts, the 4 regions. But that means giving up a city like Zaporozhye, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, important towns, Pakrovsk, all of these places without a fight. And psychologically, they're not prepared for that. Kherson as well. So they're not prepared for that yet. They will continue fighting. Tens of thousands of people will die. What I'm hearing from the Ukrainian battlefronts is that more and more Ukrainian soldiers are quietly giving up. I mean, they're no longer prepared to obey orders and to carry out attacks, and they will retreat sometimes now without orders. And we're going to see more and more of that continue, because the signals from the battlefronts is that the Ukrainian soldiers themselves have given up. It is in Kiev that the obstacle to negotiations is.
Okay. Beijing Declaration, the Hamas. I didn't know there were so many factions within the Palestinians. 14 of them. I only knew Hamas and the Fatah, but I think it's significant because they got a declaration that they're one unit now. Okay, but it's also not just amongst the Palestinians, but there are also quite a few Arab countries who were present when they were signing this declaration. So the Arab countries, I think, that are behind it. Is that how you feel behind this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the key thing again, and it's a point which I've made in previous programs, if you remember, is that Beijing is now the international center of diplomacy. It's no longer London or Paris or Washington or New York. It's Beijing. And that is a revolutionary moment in international affairs. We have never had a situation where important decisions about what's happening in Europe, like the Ukrainian war, or what's happening in the Middle East, are being decided in Beijing or are being discussed in Beijing in the way that they are. And we must not overlook this in terms of our discussion of world affairs. Again, just to say this, the Western powers are not ready for this. We were talking earlier about the third plenum. You will hardly find a mention of the third plenum anywhere in the Western media.
Yeah, I know
This
that
is
too.
despite the fact that this is a you know a policy discussion setting out the future economic policy of what is now the world's manufacturing, industrial, and trading colossus. That, psychologically, it's just not on their bandwidth to recognize this fact. Now, the Arab states who do not have these hang ups about China that the West do, of course, they're there and they support it because they want to see a united Arab Palestinian delegation in order to make it possible to engage finally in peace talks. These divisions, by the way, amongst the Palestinians have existed for decades. In fact, ever since the State of Israel was founded. I can remember way back in the 60s and 70s, you had all these different factions, the Palestinian People's Front, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all of these various little groups, many of them very extreme, very radical, some of them very left-wing, some of them very right-wing. Eventually, they all came within the umbrella of what was called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, of which Fatah was always the major part. And then Hamas established itself outside that structure. And of course, the Arab states want to bring them all together. They've been trying for decades to, without success. The Russians have also tried for decades to get the Palestinians to come together, also without success. Finally, China, because it's the new rising great power. As I said, the Arabs don't have these hang-ups about China. They've managed it. They've managed to get Hamas and Fatah and all of the others together. They brought all of the Arab states together. Iran is also supporting this. And finally, it may happen. But, it's not there yet. There's still a lot to do. We've had announcements from the Palestinians that they're setting up a united front before, and almost immediately it's broken down. This one looks as if it'll be a little more substantive. The Arab states, as you rightly say, were all there, and hopefully that will make it work this time. Now, the presence of the Arab states is very important because, again, one of the things I can remember from the past is that various Arab states ended up backing particular Palestinian factions. So that, for example, the Syrian government backed a militant group led by a man called George Habash. I can remember this before. I can't remember its name now. The
Mhm.
Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or whatever. But I mean, they used to back various factions and sometimes basically hire those factions to act as agents to carry out their own policies and even to assassinate their opponents. I mean, there's an awful lot that used to take place. Now, the fact that all of the Arab states are united in backing this merger takes us a whole step further, where hopefully this unity will be preserved and will be consolidated and we'll be able to move forward towards a proper negotiating system.
I think also I noticed that they also put in 4 countries to guard it.
Yeah.
China, Russia, Egypt, and Algeria, right?
Yeah.
So I guess it makes sense. Egypt is right there, the neighboring country, and where I think they also want to use that as excuse for Egypt to legitimately allow aid to come in. I
Mm.
think that's the purpose of having Egypt to be part of the supervision kind of system. Algeria, I guess, it just represent the rest of the Arab countries to be oversight for the process. That's my interpretation.
It's a little bit more complicated than that. First of all, China and Russia. The reason the Russians are there is because they've been a major player in the Middle East since the 1940s and 50s. So, I mean, you can't, they are an essential part of the glue that's going to pull
Mhm.
this together. Now, the thing to understand about Egypt and Algeria is that they represent historically separate factions
Uh-huh.
within
Okay.
the Arab world.
Mhm.
So Egypt was aligned very closely with the conservative Arab monarchies of the Gulf. And it's the biggest Arab country. It borders on the region. Um, it was, however, the first country to make peace with Israel in the 1970s. It's seen as a moderate force, a conservative force in the Arab world, whereas Algeria historically was the leader of what used to be called the rejectionist front, the people who were opposed to any kind of negotiations with Israel at all. And there was a time when the rejectionist front was formed, which is in the late 70s, and it was still strong throughout the 80s, which was basically Algeria, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with Iraq under Saddam Hussein sometimes joining and sometimes opposing. So having the Egyptians and the Algerians both involved means that all of the various factions within the Arab world are coming together and are lending this process their support. And again, Chinese diplomacy has managed it.
When you're saying that Beijing now has become the center for diplomacy, I think people in China, people are very mindful of that because it's called the Beijing Declaration, right?
Yeah.
And lots of people are saying, well, the last time there's any treaty declaration, it was the Treaty of Beijing, which, as you know, it's very humiliating, right? That's when China lost Hong Kong and Macau. I mean, part of the new territory is not just Hong Kong, but that was the beginning of this 100 years of humiliation, which is the Treaty of Beijing. So just so you know, people are talking
That
about
is
that.
very interesting. I didn't know that. I hadn't never thought of that fact, but that's a most interesting point. And it's very interesting that the netizens in China are making it. Good for them.
Yeah. All right. United States. Um, First of all, what do you feel about it when Biden came out talk? I find it's interesting that he actually present himself as this peace president. He said that for the first time, we don't have any war. I guess what he meant war was that the direct involvement, United States involvement. But even that is a stretch because the U.S. is occupying Syria. I would argue that's
Mhm.
occupation, right? And of course, Syria want to get them out, and then the U.S. has a presence in all the places, of course, in the Ukraine and Gaza,
Mm.
so it's simply just a lie when he's saying that US, for the first time, US is not in any war. But I find it interesting that he mentioned that to make himself look like a peace president. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. It was a completely dishonest claim. I mean, he said lots of things which are frankly dishonest, but that one really was the most extreme one because reality is this has been the most aggressive and belligerent administration that you can find. I mean, um, they are present in Syria, as you correctly say. They've been fighting. They've been fighting a kind of proxy war on behalf of their Israeli friends against the various Arab militias across the Middle East. They've been launching missile and bomb attacks against the Houthis in Yemen. And of course, they are involved in this huge, epically scaled proxy war against the Russians
Mm.
here in Ukraine, which of course they're losing. And though Biden won't admit it, everybody knows that there's been large numbers of Americans who've been killed in that war. We don't have the exact figure because basically it's a secret. They pretend that it isn't happening. But there's reports that even some very, very senior American officers have
Yeah.
been killed in the war. So, and of course, he's cranked up tensions with Russia to disastrous levels. And he's done the same thing with China as well. And we've had American naval officers talking about creating a hellscape for the Chinese Navy near Taiwan. So it was utterly dishonest, but it's very typical of this president. He understands that the mood amongst the American people is hostile to war. They're tired of war. They're
Mhm.
sick and tired of war. They've been led into one war after another, confrontation after confrontation, lots of problems piling up in the United States. They sense and want peace. They sense the United States needs peace. They want peace. But the president, even as he's been leading this incredibly aggressive foreign policy, pretends to them that he too is the president of peace. As I said, it's a totally dishonest position.
And regarding Kamala Harris, I don't know if you know that Kelly Maupin, the RT reporter, he wrote a book about Kamala Harris.
Oh,
That
no, I
book
didn't.
has been taken down by, as you can think, it's not very flattering. The book is more than just Kamala Harris, but it was not flattering
Mm,
portrait of her, and the book has been taken down from Amazon just the other day.
mm,
And then also there's quite a few articles that has mentioned Kamala Harris as a prosecutor in California. She has been involved in all kinds of questionable scandals. One
mm,
of which is pretty big one. I think they just made up. They did some lab testing to prove a whole bunch of people are positive, testing positive, this and that, but they just
mm,
made it up. I mean, they
mm,
simply manufactured some evidence
mm,
against some people
mm.
for marijuana possession, etc.
Yeah.
And she prosecuted over 1,000, maybe 2,000 people using those very questionable lab results, etc. So that was a big
Mm,
scandal. But the articles talking about that has quite a few of them has been taken down as well.
mm,
In the meantime, there are plenty of not very flattering books and about
mm,
Donald Trump, about articles about him. To me, I mean, when you do that, isn't that meddling with the election, right? You are favoring one part and then taking down the information that is not favoring the other part. That's to me is like a pretty clear election meddling, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. That's exactly what it is. I mean, you have the publishing world, the media world, and they're doing everything they possibly can to prop up this very unsatisfactory and unpopular candidate that the Democratic Party has managed to put up. So they want to suppress all the stories about her past, which are negative about her, and they're highlighting instead all the negative stories that they can about Trump and Vance. And, you know, maybe Trump and Vance deserve all the things that people say about them. I'm not here to defend them.
No.
But that the media and the publishing world and Amazon and all the others should be closing ranks behind Kamala Harris is completely absurd. It's
Yeah.
entirely wrong And I think my own view is it violates the First Amendment of the Constitution. But many people will disagree with me about this.
Do you believe the polling saying that she's now leading Donald Trump? I'm very questionable about that, about
I
those
don't believe it.
polls.
I don't believe it at all. Straightforwardly, if you had followed the published opinion polls, you would not know why Biden has been forced to pull out, because the opinion polls show the two men almost level. I mean, it didn't look as if Biden was losing. In fact, as we have now seen repeatedly in opinion polls after opinion polls, not just in the United States, but in many countries, in Britain as well, the opinion polls are skewed to be as favorable as possible to the political parties that the permanent government wants to win. So
Mhm.
in Britain, just to say, in the last general election, the Labour Party was polling, the polling figures suggested that it was getting between 44 and 39% of the vote. It actually polled 33.
Do you think if they're trying to using the poll numbers and of course suppress all the negative about really to try to help her?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
is there a possibility that they probably would do something with the election and either put her there, using some where we don't know yet. Okay, anything can happen with the election itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, uh, about the opinion polls, there is absolutely no doubt about this. They're using the opinion polls to boost her
Mhm.
and to change the narrative about the election. They did this, by the way, in 2016 and
Mhm.
in 2020, but we know more about the 2016 polling because of the WikiLeaks disclosures. I mean, they were definitely inflating Hillary Clinton's support in the publicly released opinion polls. We have the emails. WikiLeaks published the emails in which all that was discussed in order to create a narrative that Clinton was, you know, ahead, so as to create a bandwagon effect. And I'm sure they're doing the same this time with Kamala Harris. They're making her appear more popular and more successful than she really is, in order to create a narrative that this is somehow, that she's actually gaining or even overtaking Trump, and that will change people's understanding of the election and might even create a bandwagon effect in her favor as well. So there's an awful lot of this going on at the moment. And for the rest, they are going to pull out all the stops, as we say in Britain, to try to get her elected. For Chinese people who don't know what I'm talking about, the stops are the organ. When you're playing the organ, you have all the things that open up to get the sound coming up. That's what they're going to do. They're going to press and pull out the stops, and we're going to have a huge roar of sound telling us that Kamala Harris is on the way to win. So they're going to see lots and lots of that. And even as they pull out all the stops, they're also going to pull all the strings, all
Yeah.
the mechanisms that exist to try and get as many people, or as many votes, I should say, to come piling up for Kamala as well. Whether it will be enough is another
Mhm.
matter.
Well, that's my question. If it's not enough, are we going to talking about Russiagate 2.0? It's going to be Russia's fault again, or maybe another country. Who knows?
If it doesn't work, um, they're going to start to get very, very desperate. I mean, having got rid of Biden, it's
Mhm.
not realistic to change the candidate again. I mean,
Yeah.
that particular thing has now been played out. So what do they do, given that they've uh, talked about this election in such existential terms? And I don't know what they're going to do, but one of the things that they might do is try some dramatic thing in the international system. So some major escalation in Ukraine, some crisis with China, some crisis in the Middle East, something of that kind. Who knows? But I don't believe these people will go quietly into the night. They're definitely going to try something.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I don't understand why does Mike Johnsson invite Netanyahu for this joint session address? I mean, it's almost like they want to poke the eyes on the public. They know this is not popular with the people. And then in the meantime, Biden dropped out of the race, and Trump just escaped the assassination, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of confusions and in this country. Isn't that enough for people to deal with? Why does he bring in this such a controversial, a war criminal to the United States Congress to give a speech with standing ovations and ovations to irritate the public? Why does he do that?
Yes, because they've completely lost touch with the political feeling, the feeling of most people in the United States, or many people in the United States, and they are completely blind to the views and feelings of people outside the United States and around the world who will have watched this grisly spectacle with horror. Um, I think that there were two factors at play. Firstly, I think Mike Johnsson and many people in the Republican Party are deeply committed to Israel. I mean, this is a cause that they have grown up with. It is financially beneficial to them as well. Um, it was important to them psychologically and emotionally and in some ways materially to demonstrate that their loyalty to Israel remains undiminished. So that is why they invited Netanyahu to come. But I think um, they will also say to you, if you ask them, you got them in a corner, uh, they will also say to you that they did this for some cunning electoral reason, which is that by inviting Netanyahu to address Congress, they intensify, they exacerbate the splits in the Democratic Party, because, of course, the Democrats are openly split over support for Israel between those who think that Israel is committing genocide and those who think that Biden isn't supporting Israel enough. So they thought to do that. Now, we have an expression in Britain which is being too clever by half. And that is what this is. Because, of course, what they are doing is, yes, they are widening the splits in the Democratic Party, but they're doing that by horrifying most of America. Even Republicans, I think, don't like this. We were talking on the Durand to Robert Barnes, who's a lawyer. I think, fully committed Republican. He was at the Republican National Convention. Um, I'd say, on balance, somebody more sympathetic to Israel than not. But, I don't want to speak for him. But anyway, he said on our program that he didn't like the fact that they were all there like walruses, clapping Netanyahu. And I think that is the general sentiment in America, not just amongst Democrats, but amongst many people who are thinking of voting for Trump and Vance and the Republicans as well. And I noticed that just as Kamala Harris stayed away, so did J.D. Vance.
Okay. Yeah. I just find it so unnecessary. Even if you want to show your commitment to Israel, why do you have to do it now? But maybe that's what you're saying. They make the
Yeah,
cut. Yeah.
doing it now and doing it in this way is the worst possible thing you can do. And of course, it made Netanyahu leave Washington confident of support, more support from America than he perhaps really has, and therefore more likely to do something dangerous, and which America at this moment in time should not want him to do. So dangerous as well. But we are talking about insignificant people. I mean, Mike Johnsson is hardly a political figure of great substance. I don't think he really understands the currents of American political life. I mean, he's no Tip O'Neill, if I can say that. I mean, Tip O'Neill was utterly corrupt man, no doubt, cynical, all of those things. But I mean, he was a man who undoubtedly did have his finger on the pulse of America in a way that Mike Johnsson simply doesn't.
I think some people in the Republican Party, like Thomas Massey, are not happy with him. So we will see what happens next year if he will continue to be the speaker. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing is Armenia. I noticed that recently participated in this NATO summit,
Yeah,
and EU provided some military aid, and they didn't show up at this CSTO, the Collective Security
yeah.
Treaty Organization, right? And I think Russia was not very happy about that. Is Armenia going to be the next Ukraine? Is that what they're pushed for now? NATO?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think perhaps not so much the next Ukraine, but more probably the next Georgia, in the sense that Georgia went through this whole process back in the early 2000s. There was the so-called Velvet Revolution, or not Velvet Revolution, the Rose Revolution, a very fervidly pro-Western, pro-NATO government came in, led by Saakashvili. It ended up in a confrontation with Russia. He got defeated. Eventually, Saakashvili fell, and the country has been split and divided ever since. And Armenia is going through the same process. Now, in Georgia, of course, we have elections in Georgia in a few weeks, and we don't yet know how those are going to turn out. But so far, the trends seem to suggest that the current government, which seems to want a rapprochement with Russia, is winning. And if that happens, then Georgia will be going in a different direction. It will be parting company with this after having experienced the disaster that this policy um, leads to. But Armenia um, seems to be going down that Western track. Now, I've never been to Armenia myself. My brother has gone there many times and knows the country very well. And my colleague Alex Christoforou has also been there several times. I should say Greece and Armenia have very, very strong historic ties because we were both Christian provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and we had, developed contacts and things. And both my brother and Alex say the same thing, that the media in Armenia is completely American owned and relentlessly pushes pro-American propaganda. A lot of the political life in Armenia is dominated by very, very heavily funded NGOs that are basically funded by the United States, so that young people who want to earn a lot of money end up joining these NGOs, which pay much higher wages, their salaries than local Armenian businesses can afford, and that has created a whole class of people who support these policies and who are organized to organize the rallies and the protests and to back this current government. And this I've heard not just from my brother and from Alex, but from any number of other people. If you go to Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, and you look at the American embassy there, it is gigantic. It is several city blocks in size. It is a whole fortress. It's big enough to contain, a small airport or a helipad or whatever. And, the Americans are present in Armenia in strength, and they've been throwing everything they possibly can to sort of pull it away from its historic connections to Russia and to basically realign it with NATO. And, when they make this huge effort in this relatively poor country, a very small country, it works for a time at least.
When you're talking about NGOs, the same thing happens in China, which is,
Yeah.
I think the Chinese government has put in more rules about all these
Yeah.
NGOs. When I was in Shanghai, my husband giving a talk in Fudan University in Shanghai. So we were staying in a hotel very close to the Fudan University.
Mm.
And right cross street from us, which is also cross street from Fudan University, is I think the American Foundation or something, one of the NGOs, the
Yeah.
think tanks. And it was, very heavily guarded for some reason. Just it looks very different, kind of almost out of the place. But
Yeah.
so that's why we paid attention. Where is this place? Oh, American
Mm.
Foundation, something like that. And they're right across it from the Fudan University. So you
Mm.
can, I don't think that they just randomly picked that place. I think it's strategically put there to be
Yeah.
closer to the, universities in China. So just, yeah. And the
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I mean, I've seen this in Greece. I saw this in Russia itself. The Russians, of course, eventually closed all this whole network of NGOs down. Um, and of course, you also saw it at play in Hong Kong as well.
Oh
And
yeah.
of course,
Oh
they particularly target young people
yeah.
who are impressionable and easily led. And
Mhm.
of course, they can be pumped with ideas, and the attractions of Western soft power and all that, which are not to be underestimated. And this has been the major foreign policy tool that the Western powers have used. And I mean, China is a huge country. It's a very
Mhm.
sophisticated country. The government there is very strong. It's very self-confident. The people, overwhelmingly, in my experience, are loyal to China.
Mm.
But a country like Armenia, much smaller, very small, very easily manipulated, with a population that's been heavily traumatized, with a large Armenian diaspora in the United States, it's it's a different ball game completely. There, it's very, very difficult to withstand this sort of thing.
And even large country, I mean, Modi recently put in
Yeah,
I think, rules about NGOs. For example,
yeah,
what they're saying is that one NGO cannot just transfer money to another one, for
yeah.
example, which they do all the time, right?
Uh,
So I mean, they use one name and then, but the money probably backing from CIA or
yeah,
wherever, and then they distribute that to others.
yes.
And so that's why Modi put in place that you cannot do that. And that angers the Americans again, of course. But there's a good reason for him to do that, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah.
A government it has to be master of its own house.
Hmm.
I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't preclude proper political activity taking place, but if you allow these people to operate without restrictions, then you're letting the fox into the chicken coop, basically.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's also part of the reason I think China has a very strict, great firewall.
Yeah,
The whole media control thing, I think it due part, at least part, maybe a big
yeah,
part, is because of all these kind of influence from outside. They're trying to fence them off, right? The whole media sphere. Because if you don't have any control, just let all these foreign media companies to come in, then they would just pretty much give you whatever the US government want them to say, just like the West media, like the US mainstream media, right? They would bring that to China
yeah.
and then spread all these sometimes fake news and sometimes smears and sometimes, whatever,
Mm,
rumors and all that kind of thing. And before you know it, you lose control of the narratives. And
yeah.
so I think that even though I myself want to see China to loosen up in terms of this control, but I
Mm.
understand the reason for that. It
Well,
is.
if you go to Russia, you will find people talk about that. And of course, they talk about they have very clear memories of this because, of course, during the Cold War, especially the second half of the Cold War, it became very easy to access Western radio stations, which is the way it was done then. And a large section of educated youth in Russia, the Soviet Union, were listening to what they were hearing on Western radio stations and gradually coming to accept it as the truth. In many cases, they were attracted to these radio stations because they could listen to rock music,
Yeah.
latest American fashion trends, and things like
Mhm.
that. But they would hear all the politics of it. And of course, we're not talking about most young Russians, perhaps 5%, but it was an influential 5%, and that introduced cynicism,
Yeah.
and it played a very significant role in the eventual collapse that the Soviet Union experienced. So I can understand it. I mean, I lament it. I don't think it should happen,
No.
but when people weaponize their stations in that kind of way, their media in that kind of way, in order to conduct um, operations like the Americans do, then it is inevitable that other countries are going to start eventually taking steps to safeguard themselves from it. And that's the reality.
Yeah. And paradoxically, you see, if the West, the United States in particular, leave China alone, don't
Mm,
constantly trying to, okay, today there is a color revolution here, tomorrow is Arab Spring there, they always
yeah,
stir up things. leave China, leave the other countries alone. I think all the other countries probably more relaxed about the their media
Yeah.
sphere. I think then we would see a more free speech probably in China. But
Oh,
because they are constantly trying to change, trying to undermine the Chinese government, that's why China has to control it in a tight way.
yes. Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Now, can I just make a quick point here? Of course, the West doesn't practice what it preaches because, I mean, all right, you can listen to Chinese global television here in Britain, but you can't listen to RT anymore, for
Okay.
example. You can't read Sputnik in most of Europe any longer.
Mhm.
And of course, the point was that RT actually did not conduct attempts to try to overthrow governments in London or Paris or Berlin. He didn't go out and try and support protests there, but it did give a different version of the news on many issues. And of course, Western governments, for all the talk about free speech and liberty and all of that, they didn't like that at all.
Mhm.
And a short time ago, when Josep Borrell was asked, you're complaining all the time about Russian restrictions on Western media. What about Western restrictions on Russian media? Well, he came back and said, "Oh, well, this is completely different because our media publishes the truth, whereas the Russians publish disinformation." He actually said that.
Yeah. Where in reality, I think the opposite. I think, for example, the
Absolutely, yeah.
Chinese state-run media, I think they're boring, but by and large, I don't find they're lying all the time.
No,
The same thing with RT. I don't find that they are just manufacture
no,
something. I find that
no.
they might be not interesting, not entertaining enough, but by and large,
No.
they are telling the truth. That's how I feel about it.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And of course, if you're talking about Chinese media, well, you're much more informed about social media than I am. But from what I understand, there, a discussion and commentary about news is very, very active.
Yeah, they are. They're very active. Yes. Okay. I want to share with something interesting. We're talking about polling numbers, right? Have you heard that there is a thing called the Yiwu index? Now, Yiwu is a city in Jiangsu province, Zhejiang province.
Uh,
And I think 90% of the merchants, the small merchants, like hats and t-shirts and,
mm,
souvenirs,
mm.
keychains, 90% of the world, these things are produced there. Okay.
All right.
And because of that, so of course they know they have the numbers of how much merchants relate to Trump and versus how much merchants relate to Biden, for example. So
Mm,
in 2016 is where this concept, the EU index, came out
mm,
because throughout the campaign, the EU index shows very clearly that Trump-related merchants are way over compared to Hillary Clinton's related merchants. So what people are saying, well, there's at least this enthusiasm gap, right? The Trump supporters are much more enthusiastic compared to the Clinton supporters. And for that reason, EU index indicate that Trump will win. Well,
mm,
all the other pollings are saying, of course, Hillary Clinton will win. And the result is the EU index wins, is the
mm.
correct one. And so since then, people have been paying this. In China, people have been paying this and then paying
Interesting.
attention to this. In 2020, actually, EU index again shows that Trump wins.
Mm,
Now we know what happened. Now Trump is saying he doesn't believe the result. I haven't
mm,
seen any evidence to tell me there is any problem with the election result, but I do think it is
mm,
wrong for the court to reject all the challenges that Trump put forward. I think if you think his evidence, whatever he claimed he has, is ridiculous, is not substantial, let him talk, let him present those evidence. He can claim evidence in the court and let the public make decision to decide whether those are ridiculous because election is so fundamentally important in this country, right? But now we never know what evidence Trump has.
mm.
If you based on EU evidence, EU index, he should have won. I'm just saying,
I
okay.
I am completely in agreement with you, and I said so at the time. I think the most disastrous thing that happened in 2020 was that no single court had the courage anywhere in the United States, up to and including the Supreme Court of the United States, to actually address the substance of the complaints that Trump and his campaign team were making. Now, some of those complaints were obviously wrong. I mean, the whole business about the voting machines never made much sense to me. And a lot of the things that were said were just frankly bonkers about communist plots and Venezuela and all of that. I mean, that was nonsense, and that deserved to be thrown out. But by contrast, a lot of the concerns that were being floated about the mail-in balloting seem to me to have at least enough substance to merit consideration. And had that been looked into and discussed and worked out, then maybe Trump would have won, in which case, well, we would know that there were problems with the elections and we would have had to deal with that, or Trump would have lost, in which case this whole disastrous narrative of a stolen election would never have appeared. But the American judicial system was so frightened of getting drawn into this that they walked away from it, and it was it was absolute disaster. Now, what happens in most countries, by the way, but not in the United States, is that in most countries, in Britain, for example, we have an electoral commission where you can bring complaints about the way an election is conducted in a particular place or particular location or regionally or even nationally. And they have to go through a particular process of analyzing and going through those complaints. In the United States, nothing like that exists. So the result is that there is no proper complaints procedure. It's up to the courts, and the courts failed. They failed completely.
Yeah, very unfortunate. I really think that they should let Trump talk, let him present his argument, his evidence, whatever. And if it shows to the world that it is ridiculous, it doesn't prove anything, then he lost fair and square, right? But now we never know. We never know now.
We will never know. And he has a sense of enormous grievance about it. And so do his supporters, many of whom are convinced that the election was stolen. And that has, of course, had a major effect on the way in which the discussion, the political conversation takes place in the United States, with the results that we can see.
Yeah. And going back to this Yiwu index, so far, again, Trump has a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot more merchandise. Now, it's hard to say about Kamala Harris because it just happened, so we don't know. But before Kamala Harris, Biden, according to Yiwu index, will lose.
So, I can imagine.
So we will see moving forward what the Yiwu index says, if there's some uptick, with the enthusiasm from, in the Harris campaign. We will see. But I think I trust that maybe a little bit more than I trust the mainstream polling here in the United States.
I completely agree. And just look at it. China isn't just the diplomatic capital of the world. It is the election sampling capital of the world. They can predict the result of an American election better than the Americans themselves can.
There's actually a reason for that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Enthusiasm is very important.
No, it is an absolutely central thing. I mean, somebody who's really optimistic and positive about Trump is going to persuade other people.
Yeah.
And somebody who's, oh, well, might as well vote for Harris, might decide in the end that they're not going to vote at all. So it makes a very, very big difference.
Yeah. So we will see. I'll be watching and I'll keep you posted.
Excellent. Excellent. We'll meet again on Wednesday.
Yes. Let's resume it. Yes. Thank you so much.
No problem. My joy. Excellent.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
You too. Bye.